Good evening. I'm Jordan Pechas, Chair of the Department of Economics, Finance and International Business, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our 37th annual Fall Henry George Lecture at the University of Scranton. It is the university's honor to host this evening's event, and I would like to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Robert Feenstra, the Bryan Cameron Distinguished Chair in International Economics at the University of California, Davis. Before we introduce our speaker this evening, I would like to acknowledge the Robert Sackenbach Foundation for their generous financial support, without which this event would not be possible. I would also like to recognize our department faculty, specifically the Henry George Committee, whose members are Drs. John Ruddy, Chair of the Committee, Ed Scahill, John Kalaniottis, Aram Balagosian, Jihan Kai, and myself. In addition, I would like to thank the ODE chapter students for their assistance. And finally, I would like to acknowledge our department's administrative assistant, Ms. Janice McAdon, whose work ensures a successful Henry George event every year. Thank you all for your hard work and commitment. Scranton is blessed this evening to have such an esteemed guest and has been blessed to have several opportunities in all these years to host the Fall Henry George Lectures and attract prominent scholars. Out of all speakers over the past 36 years who delivered the Henry George Lectures at the university, 12 ended up with a Nobel Prize in Economics right after they delivered a speech here at the University of Scranton. Professor Feenstra, please don't feel any pressure, but we expect no less from you. Dr. Feenstra's research focuses on international economics and applied microeconomics. He has published 15 books, including Offshore in the Global Economy, Product Variety and the Gains from Trade, and the graduate textbook, Advanced International Trade, Theory and Evidence, and most recently, the undergraduate textbook jointly with Alan Taylor, International Economics, which I was invited to offer a review. In addition, he has published more than 100 articles and have appeared in leading economic journals, including the Quarterly Journal of Economics, Economic Journal, the Review of Economics and Statistics, the Journal of Political Economy, and the American Economic Review. Dr. Feenstra is the director of the Center for International Data, an organization within the Department of Economics at UC Davis that collects, enhances, creates, and disseminates international economic data. From 1992 to 2016, he directed the International Trade and Investment Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Throughout his distinguished career, Dr. Feenstra has won numerous awards, including the Bernard Hams Prize from the Kiel Institute for World Economics at the University of Kiel and the Herbert Young Society Dean's Fellowship at UC Davis. There are so many awards that if I don't have the time to cite all of them, but I'm sure that you can Google his name and you can see the list, the whole list. Dr. Feenstra will present this evening the China shock after 22 years. In his research, Dr. Feenstra examined broad data that reflected growth in US exports that has led to increased demand for manufacturing jobs, as well as jobs in services, including service sectors that are due to the export of services. The term China shock commonly refers to the number of US manufacturing jobs lost to import competition from China. So in other words, Professor Feenstra will try to provide us with an answer to a very important question: who killed US manufacturing? We're grateful to have Professor Feenstra on campus tonight, and you will all have the opportunity to interact and ask questions right after his presentation. So please join me for a Scranton welcome for Professor Feenstra.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and good evening. So the turn of the century, and indeed the turn of the millennium, had dramatic consequences for the United States. A date none of us will remember is 9/11/2001. But there's a date just 2 short months later that none of us, that's a date none of us can forget. There's a date just 2 months later that none of us can remember, November 11th, 2001. That's the day when China joined the World Trade Organization. Here's a signing ceremony in Doha. And just 1 month later, a ceremony in Washington, D.C. with President Clinton and his Chinese counterpart. So China's entry to the World Trade Organization led to a very large increase in China's exports to the U.S. And the economic consequences of that are what are commonly referred to as the China shock. So right from the beginning, I might want to ask, why did China's exports to the United States increase so much? The United States offers what are called most favored nation tariffs to WTO members. So an average most favored nation tariff in the United States is now 7%. So on average, we charge 7% tax on imports coming in. Now, even before 2001, that WTO tariff was allowed for China, even though China was not a WTO member, but that was subject to an annual vote in Congress. And while that vote never failed, it got quite close some years. So China always faced a risk of having higher import tariffs applied, and the average tariff charged on communist countries, including China, would have been 37% if China was charged that, if it was not granted this most favored nation status. So essentially, China's entry to the WTO eliminated the tariff uncertainty that China faced in the United States. It no longer needed to have that annual vote in Congress in order to qualify for MFN tariffs. So it's that elimination of uncertainty that people feel led to more investment by Chinese firms in entering the US market and an acceleration in their exports to the United States. So my goals for tonight are to trace the consequences of the China shock. For example, on employment in the United States, and not just employment overall, but employment by particular regions. And also, I'd like to trace the consequences on the policies pursued by Presidents Obama, Trump, and Biden right up to the present day. So I believe one can sort of draw a line from China's entry to the WTO right up to the Biden policies of today and what might come in the years ahead. And that's the story that I'll try to spin for you tonight. So before we start, let me just recognize Henry George here. In addition to his other very important writings, he does have a book on free trade, protection or free trade. And of course, it'll be no surprise that Henry George was a strong advocate for free trade. This is a copy of the book that I purchased, and it has these night lights on the cover. And just by pure coincidence, I have an undergraduate textbook with very much the same cover, with night lights on it. This is my undergraduate textbook in international economics by myself and Alan Taylor. So when I received this invitation to give the Henry George lecture, I thought the timing is perfect because I will soon be doing a revision of my undergraduate textbook. So in this lecture, I can talk about some of the ideas of the China shock, which doesn't figure too large in my textbook yet, some of the consequences on particular US states, which doesn't figure too large. So the material for my Henry George lecture, you can rest assured, will appear in the next revision of my undergraduate textbook. So I thank you very much for this opportunity to be here tonight and to push me forward in my thinking on these ideas. Okay, so let's dive into the material then. What was happening in the United States and worldwide economy before and after 2001? Well, first we had a global fall in manufacturing employment, shown here for the United States, Germany, and Japan. And that was happening before Chinese entry, before 2001-2, and after. Secondly, we had a rise in China's share of world manufactured exports. So here I show the share of world manufactured exports. China's that red line, just going up and up. You see a green dashed line, that's other emerging economies, which are growing, albeit more slowly. And then the solid lines are the US, Germany, and Japan. Of course, if China is rising and other emerging are rising a share, somebody has to be falling, and that's the existing industrial countries. Thirdly, there's a strong inverse correlation between this rising China share and falling manufacturing employment for the United States. And that's shown here. The blue line is China's share in the United States, share of total consumption in the United States through its imports into the US. The red line is manufacturing employment divided by population. And this crossing point that you see there is just placed at 2001. You can see an acceleration of China's share, kind of an inflection point after that, and also an acceleration of the decline in manufacturing employment. So that's the picture that kind of launched 1,000 research studies. And the question we want to ask, is it really true that China's rising exports are really the cause of declining manufacturing employment? Or are there other causes that we should be aware of? Were there other changes in the United States at around this time, in the 1990s, that was leading to declining manufacturing employment? So I invite you just to think about that for a moment. That would be completely relevant for the state of Pennsylvania. So I'll give you a hint where I was going. So I Googled Pennsylvania and automation while I was preparing this lecture, and here's my map of Pennsylvania with names and addresses of plants and factories and firms involved in automation. They're in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Harrisburg, and up here in Scranton. And while this picture was taken just 2 weeks ago from my computer screen, if you did that picture in 1990, you would see a lot of firms involved in automation. And automation is certainly something that leads to declines in manufacturing employment or a shift of the workforce from where they were traditionally to other places. So it's this kind of reasoning that sort of leads economists to not really believe just a simple correlation that I show in a graph like this. It's not enough to say employment was declining and China's share is growing. If we want to say that China was responsible for this decline in manufacturing employment, you have to give me further evidence. And there's sort of a hint of where that further evidence comes from by this slide, where I've introduced geography into the mix. Can we use geography as an additional variable? There's sort of a methodology to explain what's the job loss due to the China shock on manufacturing employment. And the answer is yes. That's the direction the research literature went. And to just give you a sense of how this research works out, I show here a map of commuting zones around 10 commuting zones around Chicago. So federal agencies keep track very carefully of data in commuting zones. We know employment of various manufacturing industries by commuting zone. We don't actually know imports into commuting zones. That's just too disaggregate, too fine a level. We don't keep track of imports, but we can kind of construct a China shock variable for commuting zones. And the way we do that is we look at increased Chinese imports by different industries into the United States. And then for each commuting zone, we look at, okay, how much of each of those industries are in a commuting zone. So if you have a lot of steel in your commuting zone, and if China is sending over more steel, that's a big import shock for that commuting zone. So that's the idea. You look at the increase in Chinese sales to the United States at the national level, and you weight it by the industries found in each commuting zone, and you actually construct what we call the China shock variable. That's the import competition facing each commuting zone. So this was kind of a breakthrough in the research. It allowed research to then attribute changes in employment to the China shock, this actual China shock variable. So in the next slides, let me just show you the results that researchers find. So here's what's the impact of the China shock on overall US manufacturing. So we break this into 4 time periods, 1970 to 1980, 80 to 90, 90 to 2000, and 2000 to 2007. And so this is the effect of a $1,000 per worker increase in imports from China. So this China shock, weighted by the industries in your commuting zone. So it's relevant to that commuting zone. And in 1970 to 1980, there weren't very many Chinese imports. If they went up, it seems to increase employment. That's probably statistically insignificant. There's just no action early on. Same thing for the 80s. There's a tiny reduction in employment. This is from a per $1,000 increase in Chinese imports per manufacturing worker, just a tiny decrease in employment. But now we get to the 1990s and 2000, and now all of a sudden you have substantial decreases in employment of -1% thereabouts. So this was actually the first time that these questions had even been asked, let alone answered, for US imports. Never before had researchers related increases in imports from a particular region, in this case China, to declining manufacturing employment. So these effects are large. These effects are large enough to really show up. Now we could break things down by education. Everyone here is getting a college education, so you're going to be in that percentage of the population when you're done here. How would you be impacted by import competition from China? Well, if you're in manufacturing, if you end up in a manufacturing job, you still take a big hit from the China shock. But if you end up in non-manufacturing, actually there's a little increase in jobs with the China shock, right? There was some substitution away from manufacturing into manufacturing. So that's good. I'm not saying it's bad to be in manufacturing, but you're facing a little more risk. For workers without a college education, there's a negative shock of the negative impact of the China shock, whether you're in manufacturing or whether you're in non-manufacturing. Finally, how about for workers dropping out of the labor force? So again, we distinguish by workers with a college education versus workers without a college education. In this brown, I show the impact of the China shock on increasing unemployment, right? And there's a significant impact for either, well, a smaller impact for workers with a college education, larger for workers without, but an especially large impact on workers dropping out of the labor force for those workers without a college education. And that's a concern. That's what we read about. We can shift our focus a little bit, and we can look at employments by US states. So these are estimates of the impact of the China shock in total, so that total increase in China's exports after it joined the WTO over a long period, a decade. Here's the impact on employment in US states. So what states faced the greatest impacts on employment, and these would be reductions in employment. The ones that stand out here are California and Texas, but that's just because they're the biggest states. I'm not controlling here for the size of states. So the impact on employment controlling for size, there's a bunch of different ones that stand out here: Kentucky, Mississippi, North and South Carolina. Whereas Pennsylvania, in this graph, it's right there. So that's the negative impact of the China shock on employment. Pennsylvania, kind of the middle of the states here, kind of the middle of the states. And we can also look at industry employment declines by particular industry and by states. Here on this graph here, I'm not controlling for size, so this is going to be the the biggest impact on Texas and California in computers, but that's partly because they do produce high-tech stuff, but also because they're so big. So here I'm controlling for states. So now we've got a big impact here in Oregon, still North Carolina, and so on. So that's in computers and electronics. Here's for machinery. Texas shows up bigs if you don't control for the size of states, but here, if we control the size of states, it's just a whole string in the heartland here, where you get a negative impact on employment in machinery. And finally, in textiles, Texas and California, again, large, because I'm not controlling for the size. But over here, we have Oregon, Utah, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and so on. So let me try and kind of summarize what the impacts are. So if you put together all these effects, here's our overall estimates of the impact of the China shock on manufacturing employment. This total increase in imports from China over the decade before it joins the WTO, right? China is still growing in that decade. We got a decline in manufacturing employment of 500,000 workers, 500,000. But in the decade after China joins the WTO in 2001, that goes to 1.5 million. So the bottom line number that economists kind of accept is a reduction in manufacturing employment of 2 million workers due to the China shock. So is there any response to this? You know, how does that make us feel as trade economists? Well, one response is to say, okay, here's imports from China. How about US exports? US exports are growing throughout this period. Here's a graph of total US exports in real terms in red, or manufacturing exports in blue, more than doubling over these 2 decades, 1990 to 2010. So you can build that into much the same analysis, and you can say, what's the impact of, here's some of the industries we're exporting in. This is by the biggest industries by growth of exports. Aircraft in either period. Here's the 1990s up at the top and the 2000s below. In the top diagram, electronic components, computers, motor vehicles, semiconductors. In the bottom diagram, some of those drop out in terms of growth. They're still growing, but they're not the top growing anymore. Now it's replaced by chemicals, motor vehicles, metals, petroleum refineries, pharmaceuticals, and plastics. So the United States remains a powerhouse in these areas. If we build in exports into the analysis, then here's what we get. So if you build in what's the job growth due to US exports, and let's also build in rest of world imports. You know, this top line is only China, so let's also look at imports to the rest of the world and US exports. Then during the 1990s, you had a job loss of 500,000. Now you have a job gain of 800,000 for this other reason, so a net gain of 300,000 manufacturing jobs. You know, much smaller effects in total than what we were seeing there before. For the second period, the effect of the China shock on US employment is so large that it cannot overwhelm the manufacturing jobs created in exports, so you still have a job loss. Why don't we add these together and go for the total 20 years, job loss of about 300,000. So much smaller than before, still a concern, but much smaller than before. Okay, so that sort of concludes the first part of my talk, where I just wanted to detail what's the impact of the China shock on manufacturing employment. I want to digress for just a minute here to give this kind of a smell test, as economists like to say. Do we really believe these results? Because this was not a change in actual tariffs in the United States. This was only a change in the risk of increasing the tariff on China when it didn't belong to the WTO, right? It was granted most favored nation tariffs throughout. So it was a change in uncertainty. So do we really believe that this change in uncertainty is going to have such a big impact? And to answer that, I can say, is there some other example of a change in uncertainty that we think might have had a big impact on trade and employment and so on? And the answer is yes. There is a case of a change in uncertainty that impacted trade, and that's Brexit. That was a vote for Britain to leave the European Union in 2016. It won by a narrow margin. There was a referendum in Britain that said, we want to leave the European Union. Won by a narrow margin of 52% in favor, 48% against. Surprised many, many people that it passed. They sort of predict if it was done again today, the positions would be reversed. It'd be 48 in favor, 52 against, but they're not going to try that vote right away. And the reason it created uncertainty is because the rules governing trade between the United Kingdom and the European Union just never got worked out. They're still being worked out today. So there's tremendous uncertainty for firms about whether they can hire workers for the European Union, what are the regulations they face if they want to import from or export to the European Union, and so on. So in contrast to the China shock, which I'm arguing reduced uncertainty for Chinese firms, they no longer faced any tariff risk in the United States. So we argue they increased their investments to export to the US market. Here we sort of have the opposite impact. The Brexit shock created uncertainty for British firms. So what's the impact of that? Right? Pure change in uncertainty. How big was that impact in Brexit? Well, researchers think it's big. Here's a graph of uncertainty, different measures of uncertainty in the United Kingdom. Here's stock market volatility, this blue line in the United Kingdom, and you see that being higher right at the time of the referendum on whether or not Britain should stay in the United Kingdom. This red line is a graph of forecasters' disagreements in their forecast. So that's also a measure of uncertainty. You know, lots of people are forecasting where the economy is going and how much do they disagree. But this green line is sort of the most interesting. This is from a survey of firms saying, how uncertain are you about rules and regulations, and does your uncertainty focus on the European Union? Right, on whether you can import and export for the European Union, whether you can hire those workers, and so on. So this is a policy uncertainty index from a survey of firms, and that absolutely spikes around the time of the referendum that led Britain to leave. So what were the costs of this for Britain? Well, there were big political costs. Britain has had 4 prime ministers since this referendum in 2016. I think there's going to be another election coming up before too long. Here's an actual photo of a billboard from Boris Johnson, one of the prime ministers who's no longer there. It says, Brexit means Brexit. He's trying to eliminate that uncertainty, not very effectively. Brexit means Brexit, and we're going to make a Titanic success of it. And here's a picture of the Titanic sinking, right? So this was the kind of public sentiment in Britain. And still is, actually. There's still a great deal of uncertainty. So what did this cost Britain, right? What did this cost Britain? Well, here's estimates, one set of estimates. According to some researchers, it reduced investment, by that I mean investment in plant and equipment, real investment, by some 12% to 17% from 2016 to 2022. Reduced GDP by 5% to 7%, so that's about $2,500 per person, or $150 billion a year. And I'll compare that in a minute to estimates of costs in the United States from tariffs and so on. We're getting there. Reduced productivity by some 3%, reduced employment by 2%. So these are costs due to this creation of uncertainty. So sort of the conclusion is yes, either the creation of uncertainty in the case of Britain, or the elimination of uncertainty for Chinese firms exporting to the United States can have a big impact. And just to give you a very precise idea of these productivity effects, here's a questionnaire that was done on British firms, done during 2018-19, just saying, how many hours per week do you spend preparing for Brexit, right? And okay, about a quarter of them said none, but then about a third said up to 1 hour, or another third 1 to 5 hours, and a smaller number much more than that, right? So that'd be like in your own studies, if there's something creating tremendous uncertainty, causing you to lose 1 to 5 hours a week in your study time, that would have a big impact on you, and it's had a big impact on Britain. Okay, so that was kind of a digression. Let me return to my main topic now, China's WTO entry. So this was supported by President Clinton. We saw that picture. People felt pretty good about it at the time, but people are now having some second thoughts. Robert Lighthizer, who is the US trade representative under President Donald Trump, he's got a new book, No Trade is Free, Changing Course, Taking on China, and Helping Americans' Workers. So in congressional testimony in 2010, he said, what a disaster the 2000 decision to grant China's most favored nation status has been for America, and particularly for our workers. And then from his book, he says, America is the first country in history to fund the rise of its rivals. We need to stop now before it's too late. So this leads me right into what have presidents done, right? How has this impacted policy, which is very much the second part of my talk tonight. So let me start with President Obama. A big deal that he tried to do on trade is what's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. This is a free trade area among 12 countries that border the Pacific, and I list the countries there, but you don't have to look at the list too carefully, because here's a picture. We've got the South American countries bordering the Pacific, US, Canada, Mexico, Central American countries, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Singapore, and then a big gap. So conspicuously absent from the Trans-Pacific Partnership was China. It excluded China. So even President Obama, before President Trump, was trying to do some strategic things with China, trying to exert influence in Asia on his own, you know, and try and temper the influence of China, if he could and if the United States could. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership was signed by the 12 countries in 2016, but not ratified by Congress. And of course, in the election of that year, Trump won. He was sworn into the office in the very opening days of 2017, and the first thing he did was abandon TPP. So we'll never know what the results of TPP are. I think he abandoned it just because, according to his public statements, he just didn't think it was a good deal, right? He thought he could make better deals than other people, and he didn't trust the people who had made this deal. So that's an outcome we'll never know, right? We'll never know the consequences of that. So let's move then to President Trump. He gets elected, and here's a tweet, or an X, I guess you call it, from December 4th, 2018. I am a tariff man. When people or countries come in to raid the great wealth of our nation, I want them to pay for the privilege of doing so. And he really believed that. So he enacted various different tariffs. Here's only a partial list, not a complete list, but sort of some of the big items you would know about: washing machines, solar panels, steel, aluminum, and many, many products coming in from China. Here's what the US tariffs were on those before Trump, any changes were enacted under President Trump. And here's the tariffs after that. So he raised them much higher on steel, for example, a 25% tariff. these are the trade laws under which these tariffs are enacted. A president cannot just put tariffs on willy-nilly on their own. You got to appeal to some kind of trade laws. Here's three, just quickly. Section 201, this is a trade law that says you can put a temporary tariff on if foreign imports are coming in such increased quantities as to harm or threaten harm to US domestic industries. So it was found that that was happening for washing machines and solar panels especially from China. So that was a temporary tariff, no longer on now because it was temporary. Steel, he wanted another reason to put on steel. So he appealed to a little used section of US trade law called Section 232, where you can put a tariff on to protect your national defense, right? So that was the justification. We need to produce steel internally. That tariff was put on all countries selling steel to the United States, including from Canada and from Europe and so on. And we wouldn't normally think of Canadians as being unwilling to sell us steel in the event of any armed conflict. So people didn't really believe the national defense for that. And in fact, many countries retaliated against those steel tariffs. And then finally on China, a separate section of US trade law, Section 301, that says if you face a foreign country that's just inherently discriminatory against your exports, you are allowed to respond in kind. So Trump put on big tariffs against China. But before I show you those, let me try to put these Trump tariffs in a broader perspective. Okay, let's work back to the time of Henry George. So here I show two lines. The red line is an average of world tariffs peaking here during the Great Depression, right? So this is when Senators Smoot and Hawley in the United States wanted to keep out foreign imports. They put on large tariffs, 60% or higher. Foreign countries then retaliated, put on tariffs of their own, the famous Smoot-Hawley tariff war. So world tariffs reached an absolute max of about 25% there. Then here's the United States. This blue line is the United States. During the time of the Civil War and later, very high tariffs. During the Civil War, those were used to raise revenue for the United States. These tariffs, some of these tariffs were also in place during Henry George's lifetime, and he was not impressed by tariffs used to raise revenue. That is a very distortionary way to raise revenue, and you all know Henry George preferred a tax on the value of land. You could raise revenue from that, from productive land that had some value, without distorting trade or other distortions from taxes. But those were very high tariffs. They came down in the United States. And if you can see this last one, that is the most recent period. They got down to about 2% in the United States. That's an average tariff in the United States. And then with President Trump, this retaliation that I also described briefly, they went up to about 6%. So that might look kind of minuscule to you. It kind of does put the Trump tariffs in perspective with the longer history of the United States. But that's still a substantial increase. It looks small because that's averaged over all tariffs. And President Trump raised lots of tariffs, but not over all goods, okay? Not over all goods. So where did he raise tariffs? Well, he raised tariffs on China. So this blue line is the US tariff on Chinese exports coming into the US. Starting in mid-2018, it was at 3.8%. And then it went up in various stages to 12% and eventually to 21%, 25% on some products. So this is an average. But the red line is China's tariffs on US exports started about twice as high, 7.2 rather than 3.8%. Also went up in lockstep with the US tariff. Every time the US raised its tariff, China just responded in kind. Some commentators at that point thought the US had a big advantage because it bought more from China than it sold to China. So somehow it was applying its tariffs against more bigger value of Chinese goods than the Chinese were supplying against US goods. But in the end, that just didn't matter too much, right? There was this ongoing tariff war. Tariffs were going up. They are still in place. They are still in place. So I mentioned foreign countries retaliated, so I just showed you that Chinese retaliation. Here are countries that retaliated against the United States for tariffs on steel. Remember, that was justified on national defense grounds. So here was their initial tariffs on steel bought for the United States, and here's the new tariffs they adopted. And I'll describe President Biden in a minute, but I'll just jump ahead. President Biden has certainly worked with Canada, worked with the European Union, worked with India to try and reduce those steel tariffs, right? Especially for countries like Canada, the European Union, where we have free trade agreements with, and Mexico. So those are also coming down. Oh, yes, here's another example. Was this retaliation? The pandas being taken home from the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. That was just yesterday. Very sad to see them, goes male and female and their cub. You know, we're not quite clear if that was retaliation, but they were also old. They were scheduled to go home, but China did not renew our contract and brought those pandas home. So it is a sign of a chill in diplomatic relations. So what are the costs of these tariffs? I've kind of described the US tariffs. We also have those foreign retaliatory tariffs. I'll say a little bit more about those in a minute. But even if we just look at the US tariffs, what's the cost of those for the United States? So here's for the 2018 tariffs, or we can look at the 2019, just including more tariffs. But if we just start at the top line, annual costs, so these are consumer losses, and they're really consumer losses offset by any gains from producers. So it's the net of consumers and producers. But at the end, it's higher prices leading to losses. So that's 52 billion, 52.8 billion. There is tariff revenue raised. President Trump loves to cite that raised tariff revenue. It is just inherently lower than the consumer losses, right? I mean, just to convince yourself of that, you could say, well, what if you put on a really, really high tariff? A tariff so high you weren't importing anymore. Then revenue would be zero, but you would still have consumer losses because you don't have access to those imported goods. So that logic even applies at lower tariffs. The consumer loss is just inherently bigger than the tariff revenue. So if you take that consumer loss, add the tariff revenue, you get the net loss, or what we call a deadweight loss, just a pure loss from these tariffs. 16.8 billion in 2018, 80 billion in 2019, including the 2018 and 2019 tariffs. 80 billion, so I think I've highlighted those. There's 2018, 2019. And what was that loss to Brexit? I think it was 150 billion. So it's about half the cost of Brexit. Of course, the UK is a much smaller economy, so that's somehow bigger for the UK. On a per household basis, you had 2,500 cost per individual in Brexit. Here you have $620 per household, right? So that's about 1/4 the cost, but still very substantial. So you might say, if there are all these costs, what's the use of these tariffs, right? Did Trump achieve anything at all by these? And one answer to that is politicians do try to use tariffs to influence votes. Okay, so we could start to dig in and say, did this earn President Trump some votes back then or now, right? Or will it, So let me describe a few results along those lines. I want to construct what this paper calls the U.S. tariff shock. So not the China shock now, where we looked at these increased imports from China and weighed it by those industries appearing in each commuting zone or congressional district. Now we construct a tariff shock. We look at the rise in the U.S. tariffs and we say, is it relevant for your congressional district? Do you produce that industry in your congressional district? So that rise in the tariff is a form of protection, is benefiting your congressional district. So that's the idea of the tariff shock. We look at the increase in tariffs and weight it by the amount of each different industry found in your congressional district. So here's a map for some researchers on the U.S. tariff shock. What's the amount of protection accorded different congressional districts in the United States? Okay, and lots in the Midwest and the South, you know, little less on the West. So that's from the Trump tariffs, and we'll just look at the Trump tariffs in 2018 for a minute here. But remember, you had that foreign retaliation too. So here's the foreign retaliation. So you look at those retaliatory tariffs, and then you look at, well, did you have an industry in your congressional district that was actually selling abroad, exporting, and impacted by that tariff? So that's this idea of the retaliatory tariff shock. How much did that hurt you? And there's one there up in eastern Washington. It might be just across the border there in Idaho, but eastern Washington. And that's one I know about exactly. I'm from the Vancouver area, and that eastern Washington is a big apple growing region. And what's that really big negative retaliatory tariff shock against eastern Washington? That was India putting a 20% tariff on US apples after the US imposed these tariffs on steel. So the Indian government targeted this very carefully to impact eastern Washington, and it knew who that congressperson was and how they might vote in Congress. And other foreign countries acted in much the same way. European Union put a 25% extra tariff over the small 6% tariff that was already there. So that totals 31% on motorcycles from, guess who? Harley-Davidson, right? So that's going to impact that congressional district. Chinese imposed tariffs on US soybeans and other agricultural products, so that negatively impact districts in Iowa and Kansas. And of course, China put tariffs on lots of other products. So now let's see if we can kind of weigh these together. Did these tariffs, even though they had an economic cost, did they really have any political benefit for President Trump, is really what I'm saying here. So this is a graph that'll just take a little bit of explanation. 2 lines. The gray line refers to US tariffs. The buff line refers to the retaliatory tariffs. And what I'm measuring here on the gray line, that's the size of the shock, right? How much did those US tariffs help you as a congressional district, protect your industries? And on the horizontal axis, what was the Republican presidential vote share in 2016? So we again look at the vote share in 2016 and we say, okay, for these tariffs that were put on in 2018, what kind of districts were mostly helped? And you can see that gray line kind of reaches a maximum around 0.6 or 0.7. That's what you might call swing districts, swing Republican districts, right? Maybe they can go either way. So it does sort of look like the US tariffs put on by the US were politically strategic. They were helping swing US districts. On the other hand, the retaliatory tariffs, oh my gosh, they were even more sharply targeted at Republican districts, right? So when I mentioned those Washington and those apples coming from eastern Washington, that is for sure a Republican district, right? You know, foreigners were targeting Republican districts in their retaliation. So you got sort of these opposing effects. You've got US tariffs trying to buy votes, if you like, in swing districts, you got this retaliatory tariffs harming voters or workers in swing districts. And then you got one more impact. You've also got President Trump's program of agricultural subsidies in 2018. And of course, that really benefited, all these agricultural areas. So we want to take that into account too. So what's the bottom line? So now I'm really, I'm talking, what's the political implications of these tariffs from President Trump? I'll try to sum it up here. So this study looks at these tariffs and looks at actual votes in the 2018 midterm elections. So it's going to correlate these measures of tariff shocks or foreign retaliatory shock or ag subsidies to votes earned in a 2018 midterm. So what's the conclusion? The tariffs imposed by President Trump did favor producers in swing counties. So he swung some votes his way. But the retaliatory tariffs were heavily concentrated, even more heavily concentrated in Republican counties, and that cost Republicans votes in the 2018 midterm. And then you had the ag subsidies that, of course, led to gains in some targeted Republican seats. But because those counties were already so heavily Republicans, it didn't really swing any seats over. So these researchers actually conclude that on net, this whole combination, including the foreign retaliation, cost Republican votes up to 10 seats in the 2018 midterms from this combination of tariffs and foreign retaliation. So that's sort of a long summary there, but this was, we can do this. We can ask about the political effects, and it's not clear that these tariffs helped the Republicans. Okay, so let's push on. How about President Biden? Since I'm here in Scranton. As I already mentioned, he removed tariffs on steel and aluminum when those conflicted with prior country agreements, right? Canada, Mexico, European Union. They're not all gone, right? You didn't remove them from China, but he removed them from some places. Tariffs on washing machines and solar panels have expired just naturally. He did not remove the Trump tariffs on China, as you may know. And then he's pursued some new policies. You might think of them as industrial policies. We got the Inflation Reduction Act promoting green energy initiatives, and the CHIPS and Science Act, CHIPS standing for creating helpful incentives to produce semiconductors. So Biden has kind of shifted the focus towards technology, wants to make sure these technologies are produced in the United States, and restricting the export of some technologies and chips to China. So it's kind of a technology war. Let me just try and say a few words about the CHIPS Act. So it's expensive. It's $280 billion over 10 years. Of course, what was that deadweight loss a minute ago from tariffs? That was pretty big too. Wasn't that $80 billion a year? So over 10 years, that would be $800 billion. That was the deadweight loss of the Trump tariffs if they had not been removed, right? So $280 billion over 10 years sounds like a lot, but you wanna compare it with something else like the cost of those tariffs. Of that $280 billion, a huge amount is for R&D. That's this middle section here, so $200 billion. So it's a smaller amount, $24 billion over 10 years. So, $2.5 billion a year. And that is for CHIPS Advanced Manufacturing Tax Credit. So we are giving tax credits to companies if they build more advanced manufacturing plants. And there's evidence that this is having an effect. So this is just, these are planned manufacturing products announced since the CHIPS Act. And you can see they're scattered around, and these bubbles reflect the size of projects. Here's some of the big projects that have been announced. And it's pretty interesting that whereas some of these country headquarters are from the US, in that case, if you give them a tax break, it's probably a zero-sum game. They're going to put that plant somewhere you know, you give them a tax rate, okay, you collect taxes, you're not really gaining. But I do feel if you're bringing in these plants from abroad, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, so on, that is kind of a strategic gain for the United States. And there are plenty of plants coming in from abroad. This Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing is a particularly big one, worth $28 billion. Here's a graph of all the plants coming in from South Korea. So it's just the number of announced projects exceeding 100 million each from South Korea, Europe, Japan, Canada, Taiwan. In fact, when you read the newspaper, now Europe is saying, oh my gosh, we got to do something similar, right? We can't have all these plants leaving Europe. We got to somehow attract them into Europe. So we could get into kind of a subsidy war with another country. This happens with foreign investment of that type, but so far we seem to be on the winning end of that. And then we could say, where are they going? Well, lo and behold, they're going to Republican districts, almost exclusively. That's the ones in Arizona we saw, and many others. They're not going to California. California is too expensive a place to do business, you know, and so many in Republican districts. So let me give a summary then. We're on our closing stretch here. Let me give a summary to 2023. President Biden has reversed some tariffs. Yes, some expired, some were reversed, but not all maintained tariffs on China, like Trump. He has recently started a new trade agreement, and it's not quite right to say it's with Asia. It's actually with the Pacific, with some America nations. So it's called APEP, American Partnership for Economic Prosperity. So it's a dozen countries in the Americas, Canada, US, Central America, South America. So he's pursuing that. So it's a little bit like China. It's not like Obama. It's not as big a deal as TPP, but he's trying to do that. He's introduced extensive funding for research and development and semiconductor projects in the US. And yeah, these may be criticized at old-fashioned industrial policy, and especially if you're just, you know, one state is competing against another, that's probably zero-sum. But if you're bringing these plants in from abroad, it could be good for the US, and it's certainly creating good jobs, many in Republican districts. So how about if I try to project forward a year? Well, if reelected, President Biden will maintain his course. That's all I can say. That might not be exciting, but there it is. How about if Trump is elected? Oh my gosh, he's already promised a 10% tariff on all US imports, not just on China, across the board. That would incidentally raise nearly as much revenue as the US corporate tax. Here's revenues from the corporate income tax versus this hypothetical 10% across the board import tariff. So that's raising lots of revenue, which Trump certainly likes to do. But we already know the answer. That's going to lead to foreign retaliation, almost certainly. So that's a big increase in tariffs, 10%. Well, it doesn't sound big, but when it's across the board, it's pretty big. Let's go back to an early diagram where we are down at 6% average tariffs, and let's increase those by 10%. Just hypothetically, I'll say that this 10% is added on top. You get 16%. That's a pretty high tariff. What if the world retaliated against that? So we had a world tariff of 16%. That's what I show with this horizontal line. That is as high as world tariffs have ever been for the last 150 years, except in the Smoot-Hawley era, where they're a little higher. So that is what a new Trump trade war could look like. Admittedly, I'm probably painting a worst case scenario, but surely there would be another trade war under President Trump. And then it seems likely, in fact, Republicans have already taken steps to defund the Inflation Reduction Act, which is encouraging green energy, and defund some aspect of the CHIPS Act. They've already taken those actions, but you gotta think, because so many of those projects are in Republican districts, maybe they won't follow through completely. So this is kind of the economic choice, right, that the country faces in a year's time. This is what the China shock has led to, for better or for worse. Do we get President Trump with a trade war and lots of fireworks, or do we get President Biden with no fireworks at all and maintaining the current course? And that's pretty much the choice that each of us will face in a year's time. And let me conclude on that note. Thank you very much. So I think there are some microphones, and if there are questions, I can try and address them.
A Q&A session, so please, it's not over yet. So now we're ready to open the Q&A session.
Do you believe that the rising, do you believe this is going to lead us to World War III?
A lot louder.
Do you believe this is going to lead us to World War III?
No, I don't think this economic tariff war will lead us to World War III. I'm, of course, deeply concerned with what's going on in the Middle East, which is sort of disconnected from this. I get asked sometime, is China going to invade Taiwan? I don't think so. I think this is an economic contest between two countries, both of whom consider themselves very great. And I think they feel they're great enough that they're not on the edge, you know. So even if statements are inflammatory, I don't think this is going to lead us anywhere. I would be much more concerned with what's going on in the Middle East, in Israel.
How do you think the war in the Middle East is going to affect our economy?
That is a really hard question, way outside my area. And I guess it depends if we get drawn in, or to what extent. We have battleships already sent over there, right? You know, there's a lot of related countries. If it starts to escalate, then we get drawn into a wartime economy, right? So, and I think there's that kind of risk. So it's a little bit disconnected. I don't see it directly connected with the impacts in Asia. You know, I was sort of reflecting, Obama tried to pivot away from the Middle East toward Asia. He was not successful in retrospect, right? We are back in the Middle East now, right? You know, so could lead us into, inch us towards a wartime economy. I'm not saying it will, but that would be the direction.
You talked about how President Biden's course is to invest in renewable energy in the future. Some of the reading we've been doing in sustainability classes has kind of poked holes in the plan that green energy is something fortuitous and worthwhile. So do you think that affects the plans for President Biden's sort of going forward?
So you're looking at this in a sustainability class?
Sort of, yeah.
Sort of. That good for you. Good for you. And it all requires close attention. I think there's still lots of potential for green energy and alternative energy sources. But yeah, if you're spending public money, you want to be very careful about it. So I'm sympathetic to what you're asking, and it just has to be looked at very carefully. I still kind of think the potential gains if we can slow the carbonization of the atmosphere and stuff like that, there's probably pretty significant gains to be had there. But you got to take that whole life cycle, carbon cycle into account. Sorry.
Hi, thank you for being here tonight. I have two questions. How long until we feel the relief of the semiconductor plants opening? Because if I'm not mistaken, that's going to be quite a few years. And then also, I was wondering if you can touch upon, the artificial islands in the South China Sea. I feel like it's been quite a long time since I heard anyone talk about that. I feel like it just, there's so much news, everything gets buried in different news cycles. And I feel like it's been really a year and a half, 2 years since anyone's talked about the artificial islands. And that's something that personally interests me.
Tell me the second question again. Artificial?
Yeah, the artificial islands that China was building kind of, to encroach on Taiwan a little bit. I was just wondering if, you've come across any of that recently in your studies.
I don't know much about the artificial islands. No. But tell me the first question then again.
Yeah, so the semiconductor plants, they're not going to open for quite a while. So I'm wondering, just when will we feel, the economic relief of those finally being open?
Right, they won't open for a while, but once those investments start to be made, I think they're going to go forward unless there's big changes in U.S. policy against it, right? And because they're in, even if the Republicans are pulling back money from the CHIPS Act in general, I think they will absolutely support these plants in their districts. So I would expect them to proceed, right? These are big, huge investments. It's not a sure thing. It's not a sure thing. I'm trying to think of it. There was a recent investment of Denmark investing in solar energy off some coast, and they just completely pulled out and lost billions on it. And I can't think of the details, but that would be, an example. You would hope that doesn't happen. I think it's good for the U.S. if those plants are built. Question behind you there.
Thank you. I just had a quick question. So they went through and signed with the CPTPP after the U.S. withdrew in 2018. Is there a reason why the U.S. hasn't joined that yet?
So it was never debated in Congress, the TPP. And then, if Hillary Clinton would have won the Electoral College, then it would have been debated by Congress. And then we would have seen it going forward. But because Trump pulled out of it immediately, it was just never debated. Does that answer your question? Is there
yeah, because I saw that after, I think it was in 2018, many of those countries in the original agreement, besides the U.S., joined their own agreement.
So they went on their own way,
Yeah.
yes.
So I wasn't sure if there was a reason why President Biden hasn't explored that option.
Interesting, yes. Trump, of course, wasn't interested. Biden could have pursued it. And yes, I don't know what the reason is. So that's a good question. I'll look into that.